The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Robert Martinez pulled his old pickup truck into a space near the front of Megamart. At 62, Robert moved with the deliberate precision of someone who had spent decades in military service, though age and old injuries had left their mark. His gray hair was still cut in the same regulation style he'd maintained for 40 years, and despite wearing civilian clothes, everything about his posture spoke of discipline and duty. Today was different from his usual shopping trips. Robert wore his dress uniform, complete with ribbons and medals earned through 4 decades of service in the United States Army. The fabric was immaculate, pressed to perfection the night before, and the metal decorations caught the morning light as he walked toward the store entrance. He had good reason for the formal attire. Later that afternoon, he would speak at Roosevelt Elementary School's Veterans Day Assembly, sharing stories of service with children who had never known a world without the freedoms he'd helped protect. The automatic doors swooshed open as Robert entered Megamart, immediately hit by the familiar blend of air conditioning and the faint smell of coffee from the in-store cafe. Early morning shoppers moved through the aisles with quiet efficiency, most focused on their lists and routines. Robert nodded politely to an elderly woman who smiled at him, clearly recognizing the significance of his uniform. He grabbed a shopping cart and began making his way through the store. His list was simple: groceries for the week, a small gift for his granddaughter's upcoming birthday, and some supplies for the veteran support group he ran every Thursday evening. The group had grown significantly over the past year, with younger veterans returning from overseas deployments joining the older members who had served in previous conflicts. Robert took pride in creating a space where these men and women could find understanding and support. As he moved through the produce section, selecting fresh vegetables with the same attention to detail he'd once applied to equipment inspections, Robert couldn't help but reflect on how much the world had changed since he'd first enlisted as an 18-year-old farm boy from Kansas. Back then, the uniform commanded universal respect. These days, reactions were more mixed, though most people still showed appreciation for military service. The medals on his chest represented a lifetime of dedication. The Purple Heart spoke to wounds received during his second tour in Vietnam, when shrapnel from a mortar attack had nearly ended his military career before it truly began. The Bronze Star commemorated actions during a rescue mission that had saved 3 wounded soldiers under heavy fire. Multiple service ribbons marked deployments to places most Americans couldn't find on a map, conflicts that rarely made headlines but were no less important to those who served. Robert had never been one to seek attention for his service. He wore the uniform today out of respect for the children he would address, understanding that sometimes visual symbols help young minds grasp abstract concepts like sacrifice and duty. The medals weren't worn for personal glory, but as teaching tools, tangible representations of values he hoped to pass on to the next generation. Moving into the electronics section, he paused to consider a tablet for his granddaughter. 8-year-old Emma had shown remarkable aptitude with technology, often helping him navigate features on his smartphone that seemed designed by and for people half his age. The store employee in electronics, a college-aged woman with genuine enthusiasm, spent several minutes explaining different options and helped him select something appropriate. Her respectful demeanor and patience reminded him of his own daughter at that age. The morning shopping continued pleasantly through several departments. Robert exchanged brief conversations with other customers, including a young mother who asked about his service after her curious toddler pointed at the colorful ribbons on his chest. He knelt down to the child's level, explaining in simple terms that the pretty decorations were like gold stars teachers give students for doing good work, except these were for helping keep everyone safe. By the time Robert reached the checkout area, his cart contained everything on his list, plus a few items he'd picked up for the veteran support group's upcoming holiday gathering. The group had become like an extended family, and he enjoyed finding small ways to make their meetings more comfortable and welcoming. Unfortunately, most of the regular checkout lanes had long lines, typical for a weekday morning when people stopped before work. The self-checkout area looked more promising, with shorter waits and several stations available. Robert had initially resisted the self-service trend, preferring human interaction to machine interfaces, but necessity had gradually made him comfortable with the technology. He chose a station near the middle of the self-checkout area and began scanning items. The process went smoothly until he reached the tablet, which triggered a security alert requiring employee assistance. This was normal for electronics purchases, and Robert waited patiently for help to arrive. The employee who approached was dramatically different from the helpful woman in electronics. Chad Brennan was 24 years old, with disheveled hair and a wrinkled uniform shirt that suggested minimal attention to professional appearance. His name tag hung crooked, and his general demeanor radiated the kind of sullen indifference that had become increasingly common in entry-level retail positions. Chad's eyes immediately locked onto Robert's uniform, but instead of the respect or curiosity most people showed, his expression shifted to something approaching disdain. He looked the older man up and down with obvious skepticism, taking in the ribbons and medals with a smirk that made Robert's stomach tighten with unexpected discomfort. "Problem with the scanner?" Chad asked, his tone already suggesting this interaction would be more complicated than necessary. "Just need approval for the electronics purchase," Robert replied evenly, maintaining the courteous manner he'd used with every other store employee that morning. Chad moved to the employee terminal with exaggerated slowness, making a show of his inconvenience. As he worked, his eyes kept drifting back to Robert's decorations with that same unsettling smirk. "So what's with all the costume jewelry?" Chad asked suddenly, his voice loud enough to carry to nearby customers. Robert felt heat rise in his chest, but kept his voice level. "These are military decorations earned during my service to our country." "Right," Chad drawled, drawing the word out with obvious disbelief. "And I'm sure you got them all fighting dragons and saving princesses, right?" The comment hit Robert like a physical blow. In 4 decades of wearing the uniform, he'd never encountered such blatant disrespect. Even during the most turbulent anti-war periods of his career, protesters had directed their anger at policies rather than personally attacking individual servicemen. This casual dismissal of his service, his sacrifices, and the sacrifices of every person those medals represented left him momentarily speechless. Other customers in the self-checkout area had begun to notice the exchange. An elderly man in line behind Robert looked shocked, while a middle-aged woman at the adjacent station had stopped scanning her items entirely, clearly disturbed by what she was witnessing. "Young man," Robert said carefully, drawing on decades of experience managing difficult situations, "I understand you might not be familiar with military traditions, but these decorations represent real service and real sacrifice." Chad's smirk widened into an openly contemptuous grin. "Oh, I know exactly what they represent. They represent grown men playing dress-up and pretending to be heroes so they can get discounts and special treatment wherever they go." The words hung in the air like poison. Robert felt something cold and hard settle in his stomach as he processed not just the personal insult, but the broader implications of Chad's attitude. This wasn't just disrespect toward him individually, it was contempt for every person who had ever worn the uniform, every family that had made sacrifices, every community that had sent their sons and daughters to serve something larger than themselves. "Son," Robert began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to leadership, "you're entitled to your opinions, but you're way out of line." "Am I?" Chad's voice grew louder, attracting more attention from surrounding customers. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like another old guy trying to cash in on fake war stories and costume medals he probably bought on eBay." The accusation was so outrageous, so far beyond acceptable behavior, that several nearby customers gasped audibly. The elderly man behind Robert stepped forward, his own face flushed with anger. "That's completely inappropriate," the man said firmly. "You need to apologize immediately." Chad turned his contemptuous gaze to the older customer. "And you can mind your own business, Grandpa. This is between me and Captain America here with his toy medals." Robert's hands trembled slightly, not with fear or weakness, but with the effort of controlling 4 decades of military discipline that demanded he maintain composure even in the face of unprecedented disrespect. Every instinct honed through years of leadership training told him to de-escalate the situation, but the deeper wound to his honor and the honor of everyone he'd served alongside made rational response increasingly difficult. "I think we need to get a manager involved," said the middle-aged woman, pulling out her cell phone. "This is completely unacceptable." Chad laughed, a harsh sound that carried clearly through the now quiet checkout area. "Oh no. Karen wants the manager. I'm so scared." He turned back to Robert with renewed venom. "You know what your little costume party medals are really worth, old man? Absolutely nothing. Nobody cares about your made-up war stories or whatever fantasy adventures you think you had." The crowd of witnesses continued to grow as Chad's voice carried through the store. Several customers had begun recording the interaction on their phones, recognizing they were witnessing something extraordinary in its inappropriateness. A few people moved closer, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Robert looked around at the faces surrounding him, shocked, angry, sympathetic, and realized this moment had become about much more than one disrespectful employee. These people were witnessing an attack on everything the uniform represented, and their reaction suggested most of them understood the significance of what was happening. Drawing on every ounce of his military bearing, Robert straightened to his full height and looked Chad directly in the eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of 4 decades in uniform, the weight of every difficult decision he'd been forced to make, and the dignity of everyone who had ever worn the uniform with honor. "Young man, I've served my country for 40 years. I've buried friends. I've seen things that would give you nightmares. And I've made sacrifices you can't even imagine. These medals represent real courage, real sacrifice, and real service. But more importantly, they represent the price of your freedom to stand here and say whatever ignorant things come into your head." Chad was undeterred, his contempt now mixed with what appeared to be genuine anger. "Save the speech for someone who cares, Pops. Your precious little military career doesn't impress me. Your costume medals don't mean anything, and frankly, I think the whole thing is a joke." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Robert felt something shift inside him, not toward anger or retaliation, but toward a crystal-clear understanding that this moment required a response. Not for his own sake, but for everyone who had ever worn the uniform, everyone who had made the ultimate sacrifice, and everyone who deserved better than to have their service mocked by someone who had never understood the first thing about duty or honor. "I see," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying a new note that made several nearby customers step back involuntarily. "Well, son, I think it's time you learned exactly what these costume medals really represent." The transformation in Robert's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. Gone was the patient grandfather trying to educate an ignorant young man. In its place stood someone who had commanded respect in situations far more challenging than a confrontation with a disrespectful store clerk. The change was so pronounced that Chad actually took half a step backward, some instinct finally warning him that he might have pushed things too far. But it was too late for warnings. Robert reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card, placing it carefully on the checkout counter where Chad could see it clearly. The card was simple, bearing only his name, rank, and a phone number, but the letterhead at the top made Chad's eyes widen slightly. "Since you seem so interested in my military career," Robert said calmly, "I think it's time you got a proper education on the subject." The business card bore the seal of the United States Department of Defense, and Chad's smirk finally began to fade as the implications of what he was seeing started to penetrate his consciousness. Around them, the crowd of witnesses continued to grow, and the sound of multiple cell phone cameras capturing every moment created a continuous backdrop of digital clicking. Robert pulled out his cell phone with the same deliberate precision he'd shown throughout the encounter. As he began dialing a number from memory, his voice carried clearly to everyone within earshot. "I think it's time some people learned the difference between costume jewelry and the real thing." The phone rang twice before a crisp military voice answered. "Garrison Commander's Office, Staff Sergeant Williams speaking." "Sergeant Williams, this is Colonel Martinez. I need to speak with General Harrison immediately. We have a situation that requires his personal attention." Chad's face had gone pale, the reality of his mistake finally becoming clear as he processed the words "Colonel" and "General," and began to understand that this wasn't just any veteran he had chosen to humiliate. The other customers watched in fascination as the power dynamic shifted completely, Robert's calm authority now dominating the entire scene. "Yes, sir, Colonel. The General is available. Please hold for connection." As Robert waited for the call to connect, he looked directly at Chad with an expression that was no longer patient or educational. It was the look of someone who had spent decades handling problems that threatened national security and who was now applying that same focus to a problem that threatened the honor and dignity of everyone who had ever worn the uniform. "General Harrison speaking." "General, this is Bob Martinez. I'm standing in a megamart where one of their employees has just spent the last 10 minutes mocking my service medals and calling them costume jewelry. I think it's time this company learned about the kind of people they're employing and the values they're promoting." The conversation that followed was brief, professional, and devastating in its implications. Chad stood frozen as he listened to Robert explain the situation with military precision, laying out facts and circumstances with the kind of clarity that left no room for misunderstanding or misinterpretation. When Robert ended the call, the silence in the checkout area was complete. Every customer within earshot had stopped what they were doing to witness what had become an extraordinary moment of accountability. Chad's transformation from smug contempt to obvious fear had been gradual but unmistakable. "Son," Robert said quietly, "you've just learned the most expensive lesson of your life. These medals represent real service, real sacrifice, and real consequences for people who choose to mock them." As if summoned by the gravity of the situation, the store manager appeared, having been alerted by multiple customer complaints and the growing crowd in the checkout area. Behind her came what appeared to be a district manager, both looking increasingly alarmed as they took in the scene and began to grasp the magnitude of the situation. Robert turned to face them with the same calm authority he'd maintained throughout the confrontation. "I believe we need to have a conversation about employee training and company values. And gentlemen are going to want to see this." He held up his phone, which had been recording the entire encounter from the moment Chad had made his first disparaging comment about costume jewelry. The timestamp showed nearly 15 minutes of documented evidence of what could only be described as an unprecedented attack on military service and sacrifice. The manager's face went white as she realized the implications of what she was seeing, and Chad finally understood that his moment of entertainment at a veteran's expense was about to have consequences far beyond anything he could have imagined. The store manager, Patricia Wells, had worked retail for 15 years and thought she had seen every possible customer service crisis. Nothing in her experience had prepared her for the scene unfolding in the self-checkout area. As she watched Colonel Martinez end his phone call with military command, she felt a cold dread settling in her stomach that had nothing to do with typical workplace problems. Chad Brennan stood frozen beside the checkout station, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, fear, and dawning realization. The smirk that had dominated his features throughout the confrontation had vanished completely, replaced by something approaching panic as he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. "Ma'am," Colonel Martinez addressed Patricia with military courtesy, "I need you to understand that what just occurred here represents more than a customer service issue. Your employee has publicly attacked and humiliated not just me, but every person who has ever worn this uniform. The situation requires immediate attention from your corporate leadership." Patricia glanced at the growing crowd of customers, many still recording the aftermath on their phones, and realized this was about to become a public relations nightmare of unprecedented proportions. "Colonel Martinez, I sincerely apologize for what happened. Chad will be disciplined immediately, and we'll make sure nothing like this ever happens again." "I appreciate your intention," Robert replied calmly, "but this goes well beyond what store-level discipline can address. Your employee didn't just insult me personally. He attacked the honor and sacrifice of every service member who has ever worn these decorations. That requires a response from people who understand the full implications of what just took place." Chad finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "Look, maybe I went too far. I didn't mean anything serious by it." Robert turned to face him with the same steady gaze that had commanded respect from subordinates for 4 decades. "Son, you called my Purple Heart costume jewelry. You mocked my Bronze Star as fake. You suggested I bought these decorations on eBay to get discounts and special treatment. There's no maybe about whether you went too far." The Purple Heart comment hit several nearby customers visibly. An elderly woman gasped audibly, and a middle-aged man in work clothes shook his head in disgust. The Purple Heart was sacred territory in American military tradition, awarded only to those wounded or killed in service to their country. To mock such a decoration was to mock the blood and sacrifice it represented. District Manager David Chen had been rushing through morning reports when the emergency call came in about a major incident at the downtown megamart. Now, standing in the middle of what was clearly a catastrophe in progress, he wished he had stayed in his office. The situation was unlike anything covered in corporate training manuals. "Colonel Martinez," David began carefully, "I want to assure you that Megamart values our military customers and their service. What happened here doesn't represent our company values." "Then we have a problem," Robert replied, "because what happened here was recorded by multiple witnesses and is about to become very public. Your company's values will be judged by how you respond to an employee who thought it was acceptable to mock Purple Heart recipients in front of paying customers." As if summoned by his words, Robert's phone buzzed with an incoming text message. He glanced at the screen and nodded grimly. "General Harrison is sending a team to review the situation. They'll be here within the hour." The words hit David like a physical blow. Military investigation teams didn't get involved in retail disputes unless something had gone seriously wrong. "Colonel, surely we can resolve this internally. Employee discipline, additional training, perhaps a community service component focused on veteran appreciation." "Mr. Chen," Robert's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions, "your employee didn't accidentally offend me. He deliberately and publicly attacked military service members, their sacrifices, and their decorations. He called wounded veterans frauds. He suggested that people who earned these medals in combat were playing dress-up for personal gain. That's not a training issue. That's a character issue." Chad had been listening with growing desperation, finally realizing that his moment of entertainment was spiraling into something far beyond his control. "I was just messing around. I didn't know he was actually military." The statement drew shocked looks from several customers. Robert's expression didn't change, but his voice carried a new edge when he responded. "You didn't know I was actually military? Son, I'm wearing a dress uniform with 40 years of service ribbons. What exactly did you think this was?" Lots of people wear military stuff now. Surplus stores, costume parties, you know." Chad's voice trailed off as he realized how weak his excuse sounded. You thought I spent $200 on a dress uniform, complete with properly arranged ribbons and medals, to go grocery shopping on a Tuesday morning? Robert's tone made clear how ridiculous the explanation sounded. Patricia Wells felt sweat beading on her forehead despite the store's air conditioning. In 15 years of retail management, she had never faced a situation with such potential for corporate disaster. Colonel Martinez, what can we do to make this right? Before Robert could answer, his phone rang again. He glanced at the caller ID and straightened slightly. Excuse me, this is important. He answered with crisp military protocol. Colonel Martinez speaking. Colonel, this is Major General Patricia Hayes from Public Affairs. I've been briefed on the situation. We need to discuss the broader implications of what occurred. Robert stepped slightly away from the group for privacy, but his voice still carried clearly to the nearby witnesses. General Hayes, I have multiple witnesses and video evidence of an employee publicly mocking military decorations and calling them costume jewelry. The incident was prolonged and witnessed by numerous customers. Understood, Colonel. We're treating this as a significant public affairs matter. Military families shop at this chain nationwide, and we need to ensure this represents an isolated incident rather than systemic disrespect for military service. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Robert providing detailed information about the incident while store management waited nervously nearby. Chad had gone completely pale, finally understanding that his casual cruelty was being treated as a matter of national military concern. When Robert ended the call, he turned back to the store managers with a grave expression. General Hayes is coordinating with the Pentagon's Public Affairs Office. They're treating this as a potential indicator of broader anti-military sentiment in corporate America. Your response will be scrutinized at the highest levels of military leadership. David Chen felt his career flashing before his eyes. A Pentagon investigation into corporate anti-military bias would be career-ending for everyone involved. Colonel, what would military leadership consider an appropriate response? That's not my decision to make, Robert replied. But I can tell you that the military takes attacks on service members and their decorations very seriously. When someone mocks a Purple Heart in public, they're not just attacking the recipient. They're attacking every family that has lost someone in service, every person who has been wounded defending their country. As if to emphasize his point, an older woman from the crowd of witnesses stepped forward. My husband died in Korea, she said quietly, her voice trembling with emotion. His Purple Heart is the most precious thing our family owns. To hear someone call these medals costume jewelry, she couldn't finish the sentence, but her pain was visible to everyone present. Chad looked at the woman with growing horror, finally beginning to understand the human cost of his thoughtless cruelty. Ma'am, I'm sorry. I didn't think about families or anything like that. That's exactly the problem, Robert interjected. You didn't think. You saw symbols of service and sacrifice and decided they were fair game for mockery. You turned someone else's pain into your entertainment. The crowd of witnesses had continued to grow, with customers from throughout the store drawn by word of the extraordinary confrontation. Many were veterans themselves or military family members, and their faces reflected a mixture of anger, pain, and support for Robert's dignified response to the attack. A younger man in the crowd, wearing a Marines t-shirt, spoke up. Sir, I deployed 3 times to Afghanistan. Coming home to have someone call our service fake or pretend, it's like being attacked all over again. Chad looked around at the faces surrounding him, finally seeing the human impact of his words reflected in real people rather than abstract concepts. I didn't know it would hurt people. I was just being stupid. Yes, you were being stupid, Robert agreed. But stupidity doesn't excuse cruelty, and ignorance doesn't excuse attacking people for their service to others. Patricia Wells realized the situation was beyond anything store-level management could handle. Colonel Martinez, would it be appropriate for me to contact our corporate headquarters? I think they need to be aware of the situation immediately. That would be wise, Robert replied, because in about 30 minutes, you're going to have military personnel here conducting an investigation into anti-military sentiment in your business. Your corporate leadership will want to be prepared for those conversations. David Chen was already dialing corporate numbers, stepping away to have urgent conversations about crisis management and public relations disasters. The words Pentagon investigation and anti-military incident were enough to get immediate attention from the highest levels of Megamart leadership. Meanwhile, Chad stood in the center of the storm he had created, finally understanding that his moment of casual cruelty was about to have consequences far beyond anything he had imagined. "What's going to happen to me?" he asked quietly. Robert looked at him with something that might have been pity. "That depends on choices other people make now. But son, you need to understand that when you attack someone's military service, you're not just attacking that individual. You're attacking their family, their community, and everyone who has ever made sacrifices for this country." The sound of multiple vehicles pulling into the parking lot drew everyone's attention to the front windows. 3 black SUVs with government plates had arrived, and uniformed military personnel were exiting the vehicles with the kind of precision that suggested this was being treated as a serious matter. "That would be the investigation team," Robert observed calmly. Patricia Wells felt her legs go weak. Pentagon investigators arriving at her store was beyond her worst nightmares of retail disasters. "Colonel, is there anything we should know before they get here?" "Be honest," Robert advised. "Tell them exactly what happened, show them the video evidence, and let them draw their own conclusions about what it means when employees feel comfortable publicly mocking military decorations." The military team entered the store with professional efficiency, led by a senior officer whose ribbons and bearings suggested significant experience with sensitive investigations. The officer approached Robert first, offering a crisp salute that was returned with equal precision. "Colonel Martinez, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Bennett from the Inspector General's office. We're here to conduct a full investigation into the incident you reported." "Thank you for responding so quickly, Colonel Bennett. I have video evidence and multiple civilian witnesses who can provide testimony about what occurred." Colonel Bennett nodded and turned to address the store management. "I need to speak with your employee immediately, as well as any managers who were present during the incident. This investigation will be thorough and comprehensive." Chad looked like he might faint as the reality of facing a military investigation settled over him. This was no longer about employee discipline or customer service recovery. This was about being held accountable by the very institution he had chosen to mock. Patricia Wells stepped forward with visible reluctance. "Colonel Bennett, I'm the store manager. I arrived after the incident began, but I witnessed the final portions and the aftermath. We'll need your complete testimony, as well as any security footage from the incident. We'll also be reviewing your employee training materials and corporate policies regarding treatment of military personnel." The mention of corporate policy review sent David Chen into a renewed panic. If the investigation revealed systematic issues with how Megamart treated military customers, the consequences could affect the entire chain nationwide. Colonel Bennett continued with professional efficiency. "We'll be interviewing all witnesses, reviewing all evidence, and preparing a comprehensive report for military leadership. Depending on our findings, recommendations may include actions ranging from employee discipline to corporate policy changes to public accountability measures." Robert watched the proceedings with the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice set in motion. This wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about ensuring that attacks on military service and sacrifice carried appropriate consequences, and that other businesses understood the seriousness of such conduct. "Colonel Martinez," Bennett continued, "will need your complete testimony as the primary victim of the incident. We'll also need any evidence you've collected and contact information for all witnesses. Everything is available for your review, Robert replied. Multiple customers recorded the incident, and I have their contact information if you need additional testimony. Chad finally found the courage to speak up, his voice barely above a whisper. What's going to happen to me? Colonel Bennett looked at him with the kind of professional assessment that suggested she had dealt with similar cases before. That depends on our investigation findings and recommendations to higher authority, but I can tell you that publicly mocking military decorations, particularly a Purple Heart, is taken very seriously by military leadership. The words hung in the air like a sentence. Chad had crossed a line that most people intuitively understood should never be crossed, and now he was facing consequences from an institution that had been protecting such lines for more than 2 centuries. As the investigation team began setting up their equipment and interviewing witnesses, Robert reflected on how quickly the situation had escalated from a simple shopping trip to a moment of reckoning for corporate America's treatment of military service members. The crowd of witnesses remained, many offering to provide statements supporting Robert's account of events. Their presence served as a powerful reminder that attacks on military service affected entire communities, not just individual veterans. "Sir," approached the young Marine who had spoken earlier, "thank you for standing up for all of us. Too many people think they can mock our service without consequences." Robert nodded gravely. "Son, that's exactly why this investigation is necessary. When attacks on military service go unchallenged, they become normalized. That's not acceptable in a country where people have died for those symbols." The investigation was just beginning, but already the atmosphere in the store had shifted completely. What had started as Chad's moment of entertainment had become a national moment of accountability, with implications extending far beyond a single retail employee's poor judgment. As Colonel Bennett began her formal interviews, it became clear that this incident would serve as a case study in the consequences of attacking military service and the importance of treating veterans with the respect their sacrifices had earned. The investigation took 3 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Bennett and her team interviewed 17 witnesses, reviewed security footage from 4 different camera angles, and documented what she would later describe in her official report as one of the most flagrant displays of anti-military sentiment by a corporate employee she had encountered in 15 years of investigating such matters. Chad Brennan sat in the store manager's office, his face pale and drawn as he waited for the investigation team to complete their work. Through the office window, he could see customers still gathering in the checkout area, many wearing military apparel or veteran caps, drawn by social media posts that had begun spreading the story across the community. Patricia Wells paced nervously outside the office, fielding increasingly frantic calls from corporate headquarters as news of the Pentagon investigation reached the highest levels of Megamart leadership. Each conversation seemed to bring worse news about the potential consequences of Chad's actions. "Ma'am," her assistant manager approached with obvious reluctance, "we're getting calls from news stations. Channel 7 wants to send a crew, and the Military Times is asking for a statement." Patricia closed her eyes in despair. Media attention would transform this from a corporate crisis into a national story about respect for military service. "Tell them we're cooperating fully with the military investigation and we'll have a statement once it's complete." Meanwhile, David Chen was engaged in damage control conversations with corporate leadership that were growing more dire by the hour. Megamart's stock price had already dropped 2 points on news of the investigation, and legal counsel was warning about potential civil rights violations and military discrimination lawsuits. "David," came the voice of Regional Director Martha Stevens through his phone, "I need you to understand the magnitude of this situation. We have Pentagon investigators at one of our stores because an employee mocked a Purple Heart recipient. The Secretary of Defense's office is monitoring the situation. This could affect our military contracts nationwide." The mention of military contracts sent a chill through David's spine. Megamart operated stores on 17 military bases across the country, representing millions of dollars in annual revenue. If the military decided Megamart was hostile to service members, those contracts could disappear overnight. Colonel Bennett completed her final interview and approached Robert, who had waited patiently throughout the investigation process. "Colonel Martinez, we have everything we need for our report. The evidence is overwhelming and unambiguous." "What happens next?" Robert asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "My report goes directly to the Pentagon, with copies to the Secretary of Defense's office and military leadership responsible for vendor relations. Given the severity of the incident and the clear evidence of anti-military discrimination, I expect swift action." Robert nodded gravely. "This was never about punishing one ignorant young man, Colonel Bennett. This was about making sure businesses understand that attacks on military service have consequences." "Understood completely, sir. Your dignity throughout this process has been exemplary, and your decision to hold them accountable will benefit every service member who shops in corporate America." As Colonel Bennett's team packed up their equipment, Patricia Wells approached with visible desperation. "Colonel Bennett, is there any indication of what recommendations you'll be making?" Bennett's expression remained professionally neutral, but her words carried unmistakable weight. "Ma'am, my report will reflect exactly what occurred here today, including the systematic nature of the disrespect shown and the apparent lack of corporate policies to prevent such incidents. Higher authority will determine appropriate responses." The phrase systematic nature hit Patricia like a sledgehammer. The investigation had revealed that Chad had made similar comments to other customers in the past, suggesting this wasn't an isolated incident, but a pattern of behavior that management had failed to address. By late afternoon, the first news crews had arrived. Channel 7's military correspondent, himself a veteran, conducted interviews with witnesses, while Megamart's corporate communications team worked frantically to develop a response strategy. The story that emerged was devastating for Megamart's reputation. Video footage of Chad mocking Colonel Martinez's medals played on continuous loops, interspersed with interviews from outraged community members and military families expressing their shock and disappointment. "To see someone call a Purple Heart costume jewelry," said retired Navy Captain Jennifer Walsh during her interview. "It's not just insulting to that veteran, it's insulting to every family that has lost someone in service, every person who has been wounded defending their country." The social media response was swift and merciless. The hashtag #RespectOurVeterans began trending within hours, with thousands of posts expressing outrage at Chad's behavior and calling for accountability from Megamart. Military families across the country shared their own stories of sacrifice and service, creating a powerful narrative about the meaning of military decorations. By evening, Megamart's corporate headquarters had received over 10,000 complaints through various channels. The company's social media accounts were overwhelmed with negative comments, and several military veterans organizations had issued statements condemning the incident and calling for boycotts. Chad had been suspended pending the investigation's outcome, but as news of the incident spread, it became clear that his employment status was the least of Megamart's problems. The company was facing a crisis of public trust that threatened their relationship with military customers nationwide. The Pentagon's response came at 6:47 p.m. Eastern Time, delivered through a press briefing by Department of Defense spokesperson Colonel Michael Torres. The Department of Defense has completed its investigation into the incident at Megamart involving the public mockery of military decorations by a store employee. The investigation found clear evidence of discrimination against a service member and disrespect for military honors. Colonel Torres continued with words that would reshape Megamart's future. "Effective immediately, The Department of Defense is suspending all contracts with Megamart pending a comprehensive review of their policies and training regarding treatment of military personnel. We are also recommending that all military installations review their commercial partnerships with companies that fail to ensure respectful treatment of service members. The announcement was a corporate death sentence for Megamart's military business. 17 base stores, dozens of supply contracts, and millions in annual revenue disappeared with a single press statement. The company's stock price plummeted another 8 points in after-hours trading. Emergency board meetings were called as Megamart's leadership grappled with the scope of the disaster. Legal counsel warned that the military's actions could trigger similar responses from other government agencies, potentially affecting billions in federal contracts across all sectors of their business. "We need to understand," explained General Counsel Rebecca Martinez to the emergency board session, "that this isn't just about one employee's bad behavior. The military investigation documented a pattern of anti-military sentiment and inadequate training that suggests systematic problems with our corporate culture." The board's response was swift and decisive. Chad Brennan was terminated immediately, along with Patricia Wells and David Chen for their failure to maintain adequate training and oversight. The entire district would undergo mandatory sensitivity training, and new policies would be implemented nationwide to prevent similar incidents. But the corporate response was too little, too late. The damage to Megamart's reputation had spread far beyond military customers. The story had become a symbol of corporate disrespect for American values and service, resonating with customers across all demographics who viewed respect for veterans as a fundamental American principle. Within a week, Megamart was facing boycotts in dozens of cities. Military families organized protests outside stores. Veterans organizations encouraged their members to shop elsewhere, and even customers without military connections expressed their disapproval by taking their business to competitors. The financial impact was staggering. Sales dropped 30% in the first month following the incident, with even deeper declines in communities with significant military populations. The company was forced to close 3 stores in military towns where customer traffic had virtually disappeared. Robert Martinez watched the unfolding consequences with mixed emotions. He had never intended to destroy a company or cost people their jobs, but he also understood that some lines should never be crossed without consequences. "Sir," approached the young Marine who had supported him during the initial incident, finding Robert at the Veterans Day assembly he had originally been preparing to attend. "I wanted to thank you for what you did. A lot of us have faced disrespect like that, but nobody ever held them accountable before." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "Son, that's exactly why accountability was necessary. When attacks on military service go unchallenged, they become normal. We can't allow that to happen." The Veterans Day Assembly took on special significance in light of recent events. Robert's speech about the meaning of military service and the importance of respecting those who serve resonated with an audience that had witnessed the real-world consequences of failing to uphold those values. "These medals," Robert told the assembled students, holding up his Purple Heart, "don't represent personal glory or special privileges. They represent sacrifice, duty, and the price of freedom. When someone mocks these symbols, they're not attacking the individual wearing them. They're attacking the values that make our country strong." The story of Robert Martinez and Chad Brennan became a case study taught in business schools and military academies alike. For business students, it illustrated the catastrophic consequences of failing to train employees properly and the importance of corporate culture in protecting brand reputation. For military students, it demonstrated the power of maintaining dignity under attack and the importance of holding institutions accountable for their treatment of service members. Chad Brennan, meanwhile, had become unemployable in retail and was struggling to find work in any customer-facing industry. His moment of entertainment at a veteran's expense had been captured on video and spread across the internet, making him a symbol of disrespect for military service. Job applications were rejected as soon as employers discovered his identity. 6 months after the incident, Megamart announced they were closing permanently. The combination of lost military contracts, ongoing boycotts, and damaged brand reputation had made recovery impossible. Thousands of employees lost their jobs, dozens of communities lost a major retailer, and the company's shareholders lost billions in value. The closure sent shockwaves through corporate America, serving as a powerful reminder that businesses ignoring the values of their customer base do so at their own peril. Companies across the country implemented new training programs focused on respecting military service, understanding that the cost of failure was potentially existential. Robert Martinez continued his work with the Veteran Support Group, which had grown significantly following the publicity around his confrontation with Chad. Young veterans dealing with disrespect and discrimination found inspiration in his example of maintaining dignity while demanding accountability. Colonel Martinez showed us that we don't have to accept disrespect in silence, explained Marine Corporal Jennifer Lopez during a group session. We can hold people accountable while maintaining our honor and dignity. The incident also sparked broader conversations about civil-military relations and the responsibility of civilians to understand and respect military service. Educational programs were developed to help non-military personnel understand the significance of military decorations and the appropriate ways to show respect for service members. Military veterans organizations used the Megamart incident as a teaching tool, showing how one person's courage in the face of disrespect could create positive change for all service members. Robert's calm, dignified response became a model for how veterans should handle discrimination while ensuring appropriate consequences for those who perpetrate it. The empty Megamart building became an unintended monument to the importance of respecting military service. Local veterans organizations eventually convinced the city to purchase the property and convert it into a community center focused on supporting military families and educating the public about military service and sacrifice. At the center's dedication ceremony, Robert Martinez was invited to speak about the events that had led to its creation. Standing before a crowd that included military families, community leaders, and former Megamart employees who had found new positions, he reflected on how a simple shopping trip had become a moment of national reckoning. "We didn't set out to close a business or cost people their jobs," Robert said, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had dominated the confrontation with Chad Brennan. "We simply insisted that attacks on military service carry consequences. The lesson here isn't about punishment. It's about the importance of understanding that some things are too sacred to mock, and that businesses have a responsibility to ensure their employees share those values." The community center now serves thousands of military families annually, providing support services, educational programs, and a gathering place for veterans of all conflicts. Its existence serves as a permanent reminder that respect for military service isn't optional in American society. It's a fundamental value that must be protected and preserved. Chad Brennan eventually left town, unable to rebuild his life in a community where his actions had become synonymous with disrespect for military service. His brief moment of cruelty had cost him not just his job, but his future prospects and his place in the community. The transformation of the Megamart building into a veterans center represented something larger than justice for one insulted veteran. It represented a community's commitment to honoring those who serve and ensuring that such disrespect would never be tolerated again. Years later, when business students study the Megamart case, they learn about more than corporate crisis management and brand protection. They learn about the power of values, the importance of treating all customers with dignity and respect, and the catastrophic consequences that can result from failing to understand what their customers hold sacred. Robert Martinez's confrontation with Chad Brennan lasted less than 20 minutes, but its consequences reshaped how corporate America thinks about military customers and the values they represent. Sometimes, the most important lessons come from the simplest acts of courage, like an elderly veteran refusing to let disrespect go unchallenged, and the community that supported him in demanding accountability.